Hello, my name is Kevin Lane. This is one of a series of videos called Geopolitics for Busy People. The topic of this one is, what is NATO? Is it a defence alliance or a power bloc? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created for the Cold War. Now that war ended, but NATO didn't end. The Cold War is over, but NATO is bigger than ever. Why hasn't it disappeared? What is it actually doing today? To understand modern geopolitics, you need to understand NATO. So let's look at the basic historical facts. NATO is a military alliance which was formed during the Cold War. The Cold War lasted from around 1947 until 1991. It was formed as a Cold War military alliance led by the United States. The original members in 1949 were the US, UK, Canada, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland and Portugal. That's 12 countries. Now NATO includes 32 countries and it's still growing. This includes most of Europe and North America. Examples of newer members are Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. More recently, Montenegro joined, as did North Macedonia, Finland and Sweden. Now the core principle of NATO is collective defence. Article 5 in NATO says an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. So we can see that NATO grew from 12 countries in 1947 to 32 countries today. The main purpose of NATO during the Cold War was to contain the Soviet Union. This created the two global blocs of the Cold War, two camps, the capitalist West and the Soviet bloc. NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was created in 1955, led by the USSR. It included the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and Albania. Now, these were two collective defence organisations. The Cold War divided Europe into these two military blocs. In 1991, the USSR collapsed. Now that meant that the original enemy for NATO was gone. In this case, for the United States and Western governments, mission had been accomplished. So what now? Should NATO have been dissolved? Instead, it stayed. After 1991, NATO expanded. It expanded eastwards towards Russia. Former Soviet sphere countries joined NATO. NATO became closer and closer to Russia's borders. Now, why was this a problem? Didn't these countries choose to join NATO? Well, the fact is, Eastern European states sought protection after the Soviet era. From Russia's perspective, this was a problem. Russia interpreted this expansion through its history of being invaded by the West. Russia was invaded multiple times by the West. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. The Nazis invaded Russia in 1941 in their Operation Barbarossa. The USSR lost 27 million people in World War II, compared to about 400,000 in the USA and 450,000 in the United Kingdom. So the scale of this loss shaped their security thinking. They wanted a security buffer zone between Russia and the West. They saw this as essential. NATO expansion was perceived as encirclement. What one side sees as defence, the other sees as a threat. Even Western strategists and diplomats warned of this. George Kennan, the US diplomat, for example, warned that NATO expansion was a fateful error. Now we have to understand the Russian point of view to understand why this is fateful. So let's just sum up why this expansion of NATO was controversial. There were two competing interpretations. For the West, NATO was a defensive alliance spreading stability. For Russia, NATO was an encircling rival power. When we look at NATO in action since 1991, we can see that NATO has acted beyond strict defence. It was created as a defensive alliance, but NATO hasn't just defended its members, it has intervened militarily in several countries. For example, in the Balkans in the 1990s, NATO intervened. It intervened in Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Kosovo. Then it intervened in Libya in 2011, and then in Afghanistan post-2001. Now the supporters of NATO say that these were necessary interventions. The critics of NATO say that these interventions went well beyond NATO's defensive role. So these examples raise questions. What is NATO actually for? What is NATO now? Is it a defense alliance, a defensive alliance, or a global security actor? Has its role expanded? Is it regional or global? Is it shaping world events? What is the role of NATO in Ukraine, for example? This is a major current flashpoint. Ukraine is not in NATO, but NATO has a close relationship with Ukraine. This relationship is central to tensions which have arisen between the West and Russia. The framing of NATO is that countries choose their alliances. The framing of Russia is that NATO is a security threat on our border. So geopolitical tensions, like those in Ukraine, have created different perspectives. NATO is interpreted differently depending on your viewpoint. One viewpoint is that NATO creates stability. Another viewpoint is that NATO creates instability by trying to dominate one area of Europe. One viewpoint is that NATO provides protection. Another viewpoint is that NATO is a projection of power which creates instability.